Okay, here we are, back for part three of this reading of Booker T. Washington and Progressive Education. Okay, here we are. All right, so my sound seems to be working pretty good. Yeah, so we're going to continue reading, and I'm going to continue giving the examples I've been given about, concerning photosynthesis. And just how that one little equation, essentially can change so much as far as your learning goes, as far as solving some of the problems in your community, especially solving problems in the continent of Africa. As a matter of fact, let's go back to this. Let's go back to this PowerPoint before I start the reading. So, just to point this out, this equation is not the standard photosynthesis equation. I use this one to show the entire process, the reactants, the products, and also what a lot of people don't realize that attached to this, every plant releases water in a process called transpiration. The actual equation that you would see, so if you did any research since I've been discussing this, any research you would have done, you would have found this to be the equation you most times see. This is what we teach high school and college students, right? It's just simpler. It doesn't confuse as much because people will question, well, how come water went in and then water came back out? So we teach transpiration in a different lesson concerning plants. So this is what you would normally see in a textbook, right? Balanced equation that basically says equal amounts of carbon dioxide and water enter plants. Sunlight catalyzes the reaction between these two reactants, and the products are oxygen and glucose. Glucose is stored in the plant as starch and cellulose, and oxygen is what we utilize in our cellular respiration. And side note, I won't get into it here, but there's an equation for cellular respiration as well, and it's just the reverse of this equation. So it shows you that there's a symbiotic relationship going on, right? This is the equation for photosynthesis in a plant, and this is going in this direction would be the equation for cellular respiration, say in a human, where we will expel CO2, right? And that's what the plants use, again, for this photosynthesis reaction. I wanted to talk about, I talked about how photosynthesis has been amplified to work more efficiently, to get more end products of photosynthesis. And if we look at, we've been talking about plants, and plants are photosynthetic. There's also algae that's photosynthetic, and with algae, the process of photosynthesis is pretty much the same. The only difference is with algae, especially certain types of algae, you instead of the process just being CO2 and water to produce sugar and carbon dioxide, sugar and oxygen, there's a Krebs cycle that occurs in the absence of oxygen, right? Because oxygen is being released from the cell. This is like a single cell algae, right? Oxygen is being released. So where there's no oxygen within the cell, the glucose that's produced from photosynthesis is broken down into 2,3 carbon sugars called pyruvate, and they enter in something called a Krebs cycle. The product of this Krebs cycle, when there's no oxygen involved, is going to be ethanol and lactic acid. In humans, when you work out, the more you work out, right? You're going to be undergoing cellular respiration, but as your oxygen starts to run out, particularly the oxygen in your tissues, you switch to a fermentation process, and the end product is, like I said, ethanol and lactic acid. So when you work out, you start to feel the burning in your muscles. That's the buildup of hydrogen and lactic acid. I know this is a lot, but what I'm trying to simply show you is that there's photosynthesis in plants, there's photosynthesis in algae. Green algae is the best use of this example right now, right? Green algae and cyanobacteria. So why am I talking about this? It's because you can use algae to produce fuel, right? You can use algae, again, I said the product of this Krebs cycle in the absence of oxygen is ethanol. You can use that ethanol as fuel. Uh, Cars, initially when, what's this plant? Ford made the car, right, or developed the car, it ran off of vegetable oil. Actually, his car ran off of ethanol, straight up ethanol. But they found that they weren't getting great mileage with ethanol. So that's when they started to work on engines that could use other fuel types, like petroleum. Before the diesel engine came to be by that guy Diesel, diesel engines used vegetable oil. The problem with the vegetable oil was that vegetable oil in cold temperatures starts to gel up, becomes like a jelly, and so it doesn't combust well, and so vehicles didn't work well in cold weather. So that's when they went to more petroleum oils and diesel oils and such. So what I'm getting at here is, again, using the concept of photosynthesis, right? You can create, via algae, you can create biofuels, and biofuels is, the hopes for biofuels for some time now is that it can be the fuel of the future. As you can see, this Science News article is from 2008, right? So there's been a little bit more advances in biofuels since then, right? Researchers have a plan to greatly increase algae oil yields by feeding the algae extra carbon dioxide. So a couple things about that. We talked about this the last time. If you optimize photosynthesis, you could optimize the yield of rice, etc. And in talking about photosynthesis, remember that it's the CO2 that goes in that creates the with water and sunlight that creates the products, oxygen and glucose. If there's no oxygen present, the product will be ethanol and lactic acid. So the funny thing to me here as a scientist is that it took them so long to think about pumping more carbon dioxide, which is the main greenhouse gas, right? It took them so long to think about, hey, maybe if we increase CO2, we'll increase the output from this photosynthesis. Nevertheless, and again, this is why we need more problem solvers. This is why we need our own people thinking ahead. This is a thought, I had this thought back in high school, back in college. My thinking was, well, if you increase CO2 and water, at the time this was my thinking, if you increase CO2 and water, shouldn't it increase photosynthesis? Well, over the years you learn that too much water for a plant is not good, right? It destroys the cells. So that's no good, but it took to 2008 for people to start thinking about increasing carbon dioxide. We can be the people who are solving these problems, right? The basic idea here is that what they want to do, they want to go to like these power plants and stuff that has a high or large carbon footprint. They produce a lot of carbon dioxide. They want to go and essentially bottle the stuff, right? Canister the stuff, and then from the canisters pump more CO2 into these bioreactors where you grow the algae. Side note, That's also one of the plans that they've been working on to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere by pulling it from right from the power plants and stuff that have the highest emissions, and then taking these canisters and taking these canisters underground and isolating the carbon dioxide underground just to get out of the atmosphere. Now you don't want to remove all CO2 from the atmosphere because CO2 in the atmosphere is what allows light from the sun really to penetrate the atmosphere and reach us here on the ground, on the Earth's surface. But the other problem with that is when the light comes and hits the surface, it warms up the surface, and the heat cannot go back out into space because of the CO2 in the atmosphere. So we need to strike a friendly balance, right? I'm just breaking all this down just so you guys see how science is so important with everything around you, okay? And like I used the example 2 episodes ago, 2 live streams ago, if you're not a part of these solutions, other people aren't really interested in creating solutions that help you. You have to help yourself. If this thing goes bad and you got to get out of get off of this planet, these guys ain't really looking to help you. And if they do help you, there'll be terms, right? And that first term probably will be slavery, okay? So you want to keep these things in mind. If you get into this photosynthesis, and this is just one example of science at work, right? If you get into this as a child, for example, and you follow through the process, and you learn and you grow inside this science, you could be one of these bioengineers that's improving these processes. And the thing about that is, again, we've been talking about this education and this curriculum, right? And how Booker T used the idea of students actually actually learning about the problems that they have in their community and solving them. And every part of their education being towards understanding, being towards discussing, being towards communicating the problem and its solution, right? Africa has a problem, like one of the big problems in Africa, and I talked about some others along the lines of scientific problems that they have. One of the biggest problems in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, is underemployment. And if we really started to tackle these problems, right, we can create opportunities in Africa, right? So if you look at this this abstract, they talk about how biofuels offer new opportunities for African countries. They can contribute to economic growth, employment, and rural incomes. They can become an important export for some countries and provide low-cost fuel for others. There's also a potentially large demand for biofuels to meet the rapidly growing need for local fuel. Abundant natural resources and low-cost labor make producing biofuel feedstocks a viable alternative to traditional crops. And the preferential access available to most African countries to protected markets in industrial countries provides more unique export opportunities. So, when you're talking about nation building, a large part of that is importing and exporting, right? You export the surpluses. Whatever your domestic market is not using, you export that. That's a way for you to make money from countries that don't have the ability, right, to engage in, whatever the activity is that you're exporting. So biofuels also bring challenges and risk, including potential land use conflicts, environmental risk, and heightened concern about food security. Now, here's the thing about this algae that we're talking about today. A byproduct of this, using algae for biofuels is that oftentimes what happens is after you've extracted the fuel from the algae the biomass of the algae is actually edible. So you can be farming algae, literally, right? And algae provides some of the things that we don't readily get from other foods. So you can literally farm algae, right? And and actually feed people. I mean, literally feed folks with some of these algae byproducts, right? And so the concern about food security, they're saying that in terms of using the space, the land that you would use for crop farming for these bioreactor containers, right? But this is ignoring the fact that you can use algae, you know, the byproducts of algae, the biomass of algae to actually feed people too. Okay? So that's why, we're doing this. We're doing this stuff. If you get children into learning about finding solutions within themselves, that they have the power to do within themselves, then there's nothing else that can conquer us, right? And the real key to it is you have to get your kids learning the things that matter. And this is this is one of the age-old problems with black students, let's say those who go to college, right? They go to college, a lot of black students go to college and they do these majors that really won't move the dial for us as a people, right? They're cool and all, You're going to study history, that's cool, but is that really going to solve the immediate problem? Now, if you're learning history and helping adopt knowledge, historical knowledge, let's say from Africa, Egypt, or whatever, and you're using it as a part of a program to engage and teach our children, okay, that's fine, I'll accept that. But there's too many black folks in some majors that aren't doing anything. We really need more black folks in STEM, as you've heard me talk about in this show a lot. STEM, we need more STEM folks, right? And the thing is, STEM is not just these sciences like biology and chemistry and stuff. STEM actually includes economics and certain aspects of business, actually, right? And anything I say, you can look it up. And if you look it up, you'll see that I'm telling you the truth. There's a whole wide variety of things that you wouldn't think is STEM, but is actually a part of STEM. And we need more folks in those areas. I've told this story before, a long time ago on the podcast. Being a science student in college, when you start to ascend into those higher level courses, I can tell you as a fact, you are, as a black person, you're like oftentimes the only person in the room. The Asians are over there together, the Russians are over there together, the Indians are over there together. Your black ass is by yourself. And that's a kind of a difficult thing to kind of go through. It's a little bit traumatizing, if I'm honest, right? We don't have that support in numbers, right? Y'all ignore that. We don't have the support in numbers. And so one of the things we want to do, we want to start flooding these areas that we have very low representation in. So if you start your kids early with a STEM learning, they will be better for it, and our community will be better for it going forward in the future. All right? So let's get into this reading. So remember, we've been reading this paper that talks about the fact that Booker T. Washington, founder of Tuskegee, was greatly overlooked, or is greatly overlooked, right? In um, when you talk about creating curriculum, right? And so we've been reading this paper, and I've been interjecting, as I did at the start here, this concept of learning and applying that learning in a practical way, in a way that you're learning it because it's a problem in your community and you're learning how to fix these problems, right? And I think this was brilliant on Booker T. Washington's part. And it's really the basis of what the vocational schools are. But again, vocational schools aren't African centered by nature. In fact, they are, for the most part, all of these schools, public school systems, etc., are anti-African in nature. So what you would really want, you would want a vocational school that's tying it back to your blackness, your Africanness, right? When you learn history in a lot of these schools, you're learning some Greek, Roman type era history. But I'm proposing, along the lines of what Booker T was doing, which is why I'm reading this, that we start to incorporate our education where it's wholly African. From every direction you come at it, it's African. From the history side, from the English side, from the literature side, everything is wholly African. And because I have a background in science, my focus, I've come to this conclusion recently, my focus is really going to be on the science aspect of it, science and technology, because that's one of the big problems in Africa. Last time I spoke to you guys about how if you're working with bacteria, you could optimize bacteria to express the gene product of whatever gene of interest you have. So let's say you insert a gene that codes for penicillin into a bacterium. You could use the internal machinery within the bacteria to produce penicillin, and then you could extract the penicillin. So one of the problems Africa has is a healthcare medicine problem. And in fact, speaking of my talk about photosynthesis all the time, you can look here and see how photosynthesis is not only important for life, but the process itself has a medical application. Most obviously, there are many plants that have medicinal properties. We know this. Mint has been reported to calm the stomach, soothe headaches, fight nausea. Aloe vera can aid in wound healing, treat burns, and improve circulation. Sage is reported to be anti-inflammatory, antifungal, and can relieve digestive distress. When's the last time you guys have consumed, a natural plant medicine, right? And then this is our history. This is where we come from. Like when I was back in my hometown, it was common in what would be junior secondary school. It was common to do a project on bush medicine, right? And so things like this would be in my report from bush medicine, right? These are only a few examples of how plants can improve our health. In addition to these obvious medical connections of plants, photosynthesis can also be used to synthesize medications and exists in a new treatment called photodynamic therapy. And this is an interesting therapy. Photosynthesis to produce medication. So let me check something here. Okay. So through recent research, it has been discovered that it is possible to re-engineer the photosynthetic process to produce more than just glucose, right? So you could hijack the process, and instead of it just creating glucose, you could make it engineer some other commodity that you like instead, right? So you can have components of medications, fabrics, even fuels using photosynthesis. In this process, light energy will be transferred into the bonds to create these products. So that's how the light energy works. It facilitates, it catalyzes the reaction. It makes the reactants come together more efficiently, and the resulting the resulting products are held together by these chemical bonds, which represents the energy from the sunlight, right? So in photodynamic therapy is a treatment that uses a specific wavelength of light to destroy cancer cells. A drug called a photosensitizer is injected into a patient's bloodstream. The photosensitizer would normally be eliminated from the body by the kidneys in 24 to 72 hours, but remains in cancer cells for a longer period of time. When the photosensitizer in the cancer cells is exposed to a specific wavelength of light, it produces an abundance of oxygen that builds up and kills the cancer cells surrounding the photosensitizer. Because the light must pass through the skin, it can only be used to treat cancer that is less than 1 centimeter, under the skin or body lining. To date, this therapy has only been used to treat esophageal and non-small cell lung cancer. But see, the idea here is that it's a beginning, it's a start. It's a start. And if you start in the right place, right? If you start in the right place, then you start in the right place, then you, and the right place is here. You start in the right place, you could learn all of these things. You can be the master of it. Hold on one second. So keep that in mind as we go through this reading. The reason why we're doing the reading is because I'm trying to show you how sound this type of education is, and so that we can utilize how sound this is in a curriculum. And Booker T had subjects that he put forth, and we could use those same subjects, but there's new things now. Booker T was over 100 years ago. We have computers in the world today. We need to be a little bit more technological, right? And so what we want to do is follow the thinking, the thought process, right? And then improve upon it. And that's why I would like you guys to help improve upon this idea. And so I don't usually do this, but today I'm going to say I would like you guys to actually support this endeavor by supporting my Cashapp. Cashapp me whatever you have. The proceeds are going to go towards building this curriculum. It's going to go towards being able to actually produce videos that show you and teach you the background information that you need in order to carry out the instructables that I plan to create. I'm looking to create instructables from K through college, because we need to think about tertiary education too. We need to supplement even the education that we have from colleges that our college students get. We need to supplement it sometimes, because a lot of times the way that education is carried out, it's not like what Booker T was pushing. They don't connect the dots. We want well-rounded people who know how to connect the dots between these science and technology. And again, this is not just for people who want to go to college and all that kind of stuff. This is for anyone. We want well-rounded people in our society, period, whether you go to school or not, right? So all your donations will be put towards it. Be highly transparent. I will share, and you will see the product. This won't be a Omar Johnson type thing where you're waiting 7 years, 10 years, or whatever, 12 years for something to happen. You will start to see it immediately. So the idea will be to create the instructable, which is a Word document that would have the background for the topic, and then it would have a practical that gives you the steps on how to carry out the learning initiative, right? And the other part I want to do is have video instructable as well that accompanies it, so you can watch the video, say on YouTube, on the website, whatever, and then you can follow the instructables and you can do the stuff at home. Now it will require some research in terms of trying to, because the other thing I want to do, I want to make this something that's affordable. Again, I want to make it where your kitchen can be your lab, and you could use household products, and or if you have to, very cheap items to be able to see these processes through. All right, enough of that. So that's $bittermedz. It's the same handle I have on Twitter. Make sure to follow me on Twitter, follow me on all social media, and make sure to donate whatever you can, whenever you can, to the Cashapp. Now to the paper. Let's do this. So where we left off last time is where we will begin this time. We're going to talk about problem solving and the natural environment. Practical life-related education was the foundation to the Tuskegee ideal. Whether the students studied about the life cycles of a bee colony, the regeneration of soil, or some aspect of one of the mechanical industries, it was important that they exercise the faculty and observation in their study. Washington stated the object of the work in nature study, as taught in the academic department, is to train the faculty of observation, create an interest in and love of nature, gain knowledge which will be of service in the future, and to cultivate a practical interest in agriculture. Now, if you notice something about what Washington said there, again, Washington said this back in 1904. So we are well beyond 100 years since Washington did this work, right? But if you notice something, right? Notice something in this statement right here. Does Washington ever talk about a job? To train the faculty of observation, create an interest in and love of nature, gain knowledge which will be of service in the future, and to cultivate a practical interest in agriculture. It doesn't talk about a job. So we're not building curriculum for just to send our people out to be employed by others. That's absolutely what we don't want. We want to develop a curriculum that makes our people more observant of nature around them, make them more interested and have a love for it, and not just nature, but just the environment around you, right? Gain knowledge about what's going on around you, and to be of service in the future, right? And again, this isn't talking about a job. This is not talking about college or anything. At least I'm not talking about college. This is about our people just having understanding and knowledge, right? And you want to cultivate that from a young age, okay? Observation was not to be passive. Observation was to be the first step in the process of finding answers. Observing things was the means to acquiring greater meaning. It is an active process. In short, according to John Dewey, observation becomes scientific in nature. Well, the thing that they're not saying here, at least not at this point, is that observation is the first step really to the scientific method, right? You observe, then you ask a question. Then you form a hypothesis. So observe, ask a question, do background research, and form a hypothesis, right? So, you know, this is what the ancestor was doing over 100 years ago. Observation can be explained along two lines of thought: the extensive field of observation and the intensive field. At Tuskegee, students observed the extensive field of nature study through their day-to-day activities. By interacting with the environment, they saw the interplay between plants and animals, insects, and soil. They were able to see the entire orchestra of natural life because of the rural nature of Tuskegee. Dewey, in 1910, referred to this as the observation of the extensive. The extensive field of observation is the wide panorama of the field of inquiry that gives the student a feeling for the reality of the field of inquiry, a sense of its bearings and possibilities, and to store his mind with materials that imagination may transform into suggestion. I mean, this is powerful stuff. If only we can do this on a wide scale. In addition to the extensive, Washington students were able to observe the intensive field of nature, particularly in the field of agriculture. Tuskegee was fortunate to have the great experimenter George Washington Carver. Many of Carver's agricultural experiments involve analyzing and testing the quality of farm soil. Carver's experiments demonstrated the value of scientific cultivation, resulting in superior qualities of hybrid cotton and other agricultural products. These experiments required very focused or intensive observation. The intensive study is necessary for limiting the problem and for securing the conditions of experimental testing. The benefits of having the opportunity for the intensive as well as the extensive is to develop in the student the discipline necessary for the technical scientific method of discovery and testing, while helping the student to retain their sense of perspective, right? I'll tell you something I see a lot. I see a lot of black students go into college or walk into these biology classes and they claim they're trying to go to med school. And I've seen a lot of the white instructors kind of say and kind of kiki and like, oh, these kids, now they say it in general, but these kids won't make it to college, all right? They're talking about the black and white, but really, the black students have a huge hill to climb, right? For all the obvious reasons. But a big part of it is they never were really trained, right, for the intensive as well as the extensive. So they haven't developed the discipline. One of the most undisciplined students you could find is really one of us in a science class. It's rare that I see. It's rare, and it's heartwarming when I do see it. But we don't have the discipline, and you don't just reach 17, 18 years old and walk into a college, and now you're gonna have the discipline for the rigors of these sciences, which are prerequisite to get to medical school. And so if we could get to these kids early, right, and give them the discipline necessary for the technical scientific method of discovery and testing, while helping that student to retain their sense of perspective, that's what we need to do. Trust me, I see it all the time. If you have college-age kids, you probably have noticed or wondered why certain things aren't going the way you think they should go with your students as far as school goes. That discipline, we just don't foster it, and don't expect white folks to foster it in your children. Having explored the Tuskegee environment, the students were able to place their observations in a social context that allowed them to reflect on the course of action that would best suit the community's need. They had thoroughly investigated the problems of the community. Is this flour, bran, and baking powder pure? Is the fertilizer of high grade? How shall the sick room be disinfected? How shall we destroy the cabbage devouring worms? These problems and more affected daily living and were the problems that were investigated in the chemistry and physics labs. In addition, the students investigated the various industrial plants to see the applications of physics. While the courses of study at Tuskegee were based on the best available knowledge, the true learning experience came from the processes that allowed the students to employ the method of intelligence. So, all that basically means is we'll tell you what's out there, like I just been telling you about photosynthesis and what's going on, right? But it's your intelligence fostered through this learning experience, the way this learning experience unfolds. That is what's going to take you to the moon, so to speak, right? Take what you get, build upon it through the rigors of the learning experience and your intelligence. The opportunity to reflect and to problem solve in a natural environment was provided by the theory classes. For example, the advanced level students spend the last term of their senior year studying the various disciplines of civil engineering: arithmetic, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, and surveying. The principles of measurement were learned in discipline-centered classes, but the application were used to build roads, develop maps, and to lay housing lots. In the practical setting of a working environment, students were able to see theories applied in real-life settings. For example, in one of his unpublished reports he wrote, and before I read that, I'll say this. We've all probably heard it. We've all probably heard the high school student, or the adult who posts some meme on social media or has some snarky remark of, all that algebra and trigonometry I learned, and geometry, what purpose, for what purpose did I learn? When's the last time you've ever used any of those, any of those disciplines? Well, you see, this is the thing. If you learn and then apply, right, those two things going hand in hand, you will see the principles at work. And I believe if you come up in this type of education system, you will choose, let's say you do decide to go to a college, you will choose a discipline that you're familiar with. You're familiar with what it requires, right? Unlike some of my biology students who come in and have no idea what level of work you need to put in, right? You wouldn't have that problem. You would have been kind of molding your people from young to fill the critical roles that your nation or society will need in the future. So there would be no one talking about, all that, arithmetic and geometry I learned. When's the last time I've used it? You would be using it. For example, in one of his unpublished reports, he wrote, a class under the direction of the teacher visited the new steam plant. A discussion arose as to the length of a certain section of the line. Guesses were made, developing judgment. Some of the most inactive under other conditions were enthusiastic guessers. A proposition arose, that which the teacher sought, to measure the section. A line was near at hand, to the credit of the teacher's ever-preparedness. The measures were taken, then an estimate of the number of cubic yards of dirt removed, cost of this work, out of which grew a discussion of the wages of the laborer, then the cost of living, the possibility of sustaining a family on these wages, and so on, making it a class of real human beings, people who talked, who thought, and lived. In this exercise, judgment was developed, square measure, cubic measure, and even percentages were figured. Nothing stiff, nothing inactive, a real workshop. I like that passage. You see, this is what we're talking about. This is what we're talking about. Listen to what the ancestor said here. He said, there were enthusiastic guessers, right? People who may have been inactive under other conditions became enthusiastic in this topic. Remember, I talked about this in the previous parts of this of these live streams on this topic. We lose our kids in as early as grade 3. We lose our kids because these schools aren't speaking to them, so to speak, right? They're not teaching to them. They're not teaching to their interests. They're not, connecting and tying a string between, their interests or the problems that they see in their life. It's a totally disconnected education. And that's how I would describe the European education period, as disconnected. It's completely disconnected. But here, even the kids who, for whatever reasons, wouldn't have talked much, they got to talking. They got to guessing and thinking, right? And then these discussions about how to go about doing this work, right, led to a discussion of wages of the laborers, the cost of living, the possibility of sustaining a family. These are kids learning the skills that they're going to need in life. Not just for themselves, but also for their community. That's powerful stuff. Ask yourself this question. If you have kids who are in schools, are the schools doing this for your kids really? Every other week I see some posts about, instead of learning trigonometry and geometry, maybe they should have taught us how to balance a budget and balance a checkbook and all that stuff. How about you get all of it? How about you get the algebra, the trig, the geometry, etc., and you also get some understanding on livable wages and how to balance your budget and all that kind of stuff. Two things can happen at the same time. So ask yourself, do your kids get this kind of rounded education that applies directly and prepares them for their own life? Really? Did you get it in school? I'll wager to say that you didn't. Right? Because the European education is highly disconnected. So, this YouTube thing is a weird thing. Like, I guess if you don't have enough going on the screen, you get these errors that it's not receiving enough video or something like that. It feels strange how they do this stuff. Whatever. In effect, the Tuskegee curriculum was constructed around a triumvirate of instructional settings: A, the academic classrooms; B, the industrial shops and fields; and C, the theory classes directly connected to the industrial shops and fields. Got to remember to come back and look this up. Right. While these were three distinct units, they were thoroughly integrated around a unified purpose of solving problems for the students living at the institutions and the surrounding community. Right? This is what you call education for nation building. In How We Think, Dewey in 1910 made the point that the complete act of thought involves applying prior knowledge of principles in a situation of facts, and conversely analyzing facts in the context of prior knowledge of principles. The student's ability to apply inductive reasoning, moving from a situation of facts to general principles, and deductive reasoning moving from general principles to a set of facts, is what Dewey referred to as the complete act of thought or the double movement of reflection. He stated, roughly speaking, the first of these movements is inductive, the second deductive. A complete act of thought involves both. It involves, that is, a fruitful interaction of observed or recollected particular considerations and of inclusive and far-reaching general meanings, right? The student's ability to create hypotheses based upon previously learned principles provides the learner with a basis for reflective thought. Further, according to Dewey in 1910, the only way to acquire knowledge through the complete act of thought is by experiencing the new knowledge in a problem-solving situation. He wrote, the assumption that information which has been accumulated apart from use in the recognition and solution of a problem may later on be freely employed at will by thought is quite false. The skill at the ready command of intelligence is the skill acquired with the aid of intelligence. The only information which otherwise can be accident can be put to logical use is that acquired in the course of thinking. Okay, so I just was checking something. With the correlation between the classes and the industries, Tuskegee always offered an opportunity for praxis. In particular, the theory classes provide a structural component to the curriculum that had the sole function of ensuring an integration of theory and practice and dealing with emerging situations. This dynamic curriculum was fully unified and set in a progressive context that viewed the development of the mind as organic to the social environment. In a written report, Washington wrote, "We have thus used in teaching and for teaching material the things about us, that which everybody touches or may touch every day, the school plant and school surroundings, including the farm with its various activities, the shop of whatever sort, the building operations, the accounting offices, business operations, purchases, sales, supplies. In fact, we use every phase of the institution. Thus it is that we use our entire plant as a laboratory." So it's all connected. It's all connected. And this is, so you'll notice like with college students, like a couple years, it's more than a few years now, like maybe 20 years ago. So it became popular in a lot of these colleges and universities to offer like a double major in business administration. So you would have like someone is in school doing, let's say, chemical engineering, right, or computer engineering, and it became popular to create like a double major. So let's say you were in your master's doing chemical engineering. It wasn't uncommon to be doing chemical engineering and a master's in business administration, right? Because at some point they realized that when you have those kind of careers, right, there's opportunities there for you to become your own boss. But if you've never had the instruction on how to run business, right? You have no idea on business operations. You have no idea about purchases, sales, supplies, accounting, things of that nature. It's harder for you to go in business for yourself when you don't understand those things ahead of time. You could learn it on the fly, but it can be very problematic, right? So about 20 or so years ago, they started to, it became very common to see it in brochures for colleges and stuff like that that you could do these dual majors where you get a business degree as well as the degree of your choice. And again, this is what we need to be doing. You want to talk about balance, balancing a checkbook or balancing budgets and accounting and all that stuff, that's what we can do. We can do that. We can make that happen. We just need everyone who has the expertise or the willingness to help to come on board and help. Yeah, so finally, in this social context, where the interest of the individual was stimulated by the needs of the community, it was important to maintain the unity between the curriculum and the environment. In an unpublished institutional report, Washington stated, in using this plant as a laboratory, we have followed another important pedagogical principle. We have enlisted the interest, the knowledge, and the activity of the student as a part of this process. Again, these words from Washington, which were written around 1904, anticipated John Dewey's How We Think, which was written in 1910. So basically, again, the white boy comes along and kind of regurgitates some shit that we did, right? Dewey stated that interest is one way in which curiosity about a problem is maintained. Curiosity rises above the organic and the social planes and becomes intellectual in the degree in which it is transformed into interest in problems provoked by the observations of things and the accumulation of material. To be open-minded, nature and social experience are full of varied and subtle challenges to look further. So, you could be learning to solve problems here or in Africa, preferably in Africa. And because of how life really works, as you're focused on that problem, variations of that problem will occur. And there might not be huge variations, they can be subtle, but there's still challenges, there's still problems, right? And so the beauty of it is that you always are of use. Once you begin this type of learning process, you're always of use because the social experience is full of these little challenges that come up. Your expertise is always of use. To the open mind, the possibilities are limitless when tooled with the powers of intelligence and observation. What fuels the mind is interest, and what fosters interest is the ability to observe and to question. In nature study, they were trained in the faculty of observation to appreciate the beauty of nature, to gain scientific knowledge and practical interest in agriculture. With their hands, they were able to probe, observe, investigate, and study. This, for Washington, was the primary mode of learning. While I have never wished to underestimate the awakening power of purely mental training, I believe that this visible, tangible contact with nature gave me inspirations and ambitions which could not have come in any other way. I favor the most thorough menial training and the highest development of mind, but I want to see those linked with the common things of the universal life about our doors. But I want to see these linked with the common things of the universal life about our doors. Yeah. You gotta connect it. The literature on industrial education support Washington's view that manual education mitigates thinking and stimulates the method of intelligence. The literature extends from a psychological awareness that thought is constructed through the process of stimuli entering into the brain by way of the five senses. As such, the learning process is enhanced when all avenues that receive and respond to information are in use. According to Charles Bennett in 1926, sense perception, that is seeing, touching, hearing, smelling, tasting, doing, is the basis for impressions and consequently knowledge. Pestalozzi expressed this view by stating, sense impressions joined to exercises in language for expressing the different impressions received must be the foundation of education, right? So you experience it, you think about it, and then you can communicate it, right? And that's how we learn. In fact, when I teach the scientific method, one of the things I stress to students is that let's say you follow the steps of scientific inquiry, right, on a particular question. And let's say, you have your hypothesis, and when you analyze your data from the test of the hypothesis, from the experiment itself, let's say that it opposes your hypothesis. You don't just throw away the experiment because your data, after you've tested the hypothesis through an experiment, you don't just throw it away and say, well, it's no good, it's of no use. No, you keep it and you report it to the scientific community, because now the rest of the scientific community who has access to your data can determine, well, that's not a direction I want to go because of the data that this person got, or they can determine, well, I'm going to go in that direction, but I'm going to look at it in a slightly different way. I'm going to change a variable here, change a variable there, and see what happens, right? So that's a part of education. Part of the education is people do stuff, they think about it, they communicate, they write about it, they talk about it, and that adds to the education, to the knowledge base of everyone involved, okay? And again, I know I keep talking about this curriculum I'm trying to build, but again, this is what it's about. Let's say I put out a instructable on how to transform bacteria. That is, make bacteria express a gene of interest that I have, right? So I take a gene from somewhere else. Let's say, to use an example I've used before, let's say the gene is a gene that encodes for a protein that when you shine a UV light on it, it illuminates green, right? A green fluorescent protein. So let's say I put that instructable out there, and let's say there's a dozen different students or families that follow the protocol. But only 2 of them actually are able to transform the bacteria to express this green fluorescent protein. Once you let me know that, that tells me that I gotta do something to optimize this protocol so that I get more closer to 10 out of 12 people who get who get the intended results, right? That's a part of the doing, the discussing, thinking about it, and adding to the body of knowledge once again. This concept was a principal factor to the theory of progressive education. Washington not only recognized this, but also applied and tested the new pedagogy in the total setting of an educational institution. Years later, Dewey wrote and advocated for manual training for children and vocational education for adolescents, and a comprehensive curriculum as a means for developing social power and insight. These guys, God damn. A black man can't do nothing without you folks coming along and making it seem like you thought it up, huh? Yeah, so this tells you, even what Dewey was talking about here, this tells you that you got to give those kids manual training, right? And some vocational education. This is why you see, like, there's these toys. When my kids were small, I contemplated it. But there's these toys, you'll see it's like a workshop, like a Home Depot type workshop, and they can hammer stuff and, fit pegs, round pegs into round holes and all that kind of stuff. And there's one that they do for girls that really kind of irks me a little bit. It's like a kitchen, right? They have a little kitchen they could work in with a little oven and all that kind of stuff, which is kind of maddening a little bit to me sometimes. But yeah, they understood from what Booker T did and actualized that you got to get some manual training in from childhood, from young children, right? And the curriculum has to be comprehensive. Everything that they're learning has to be interrelated, right? So now we go to a section called Washington's Pragmatism. And Washington's Pragmatism. Nothing more accurately describes the philosophy of Booker T. Washington than the principles of pragmatism. He espoused a core set of ideas that were consistent with the basic tenets of pragmatism. The belief that human intelligence is developed through a natural interaction with the surrounding environment, and a belief in social development arising out of an organic interaction among the diverse members of society and their environment. Which, by the way, I've noticed this here in America a lot. Home a little bit too, but here I've noticed it a lot where, a lot of mothers here, black mothers, tend not to let their sons really socially interact a lot. They keep them inside, they keep them fed, or keep them, playing some video games or whatever inside, doing their homework, whatever. But they don't, and I see that like when the weather's good here in New York, like these kids will stay inside all day, unless a man comes through and says, and I'm not trying to cast any aspersions on our women or anything, but I'm just saying that it's an observation I've made. And a guy has to come through and kind of pull them guys, those kids outside. Let's go outside and do stuff. You gotta interact, right? You gotta interact. You gotta interact with different peoples within your community, right? That's a part of the education process as well. There's a social part. A lot of us miss the social part. This is why, if you've ever been on a college campus and stuff, and you see some folks who are just complete squares, right? Ineffectual, just complete, don't expect, anyway, let me not talk about them too badly, but don't expect too much from them, right? They might be relatively smart or whatever, but, they can't hold a conversation. They can't even look you in the eye to talk to, right? Washington was criticized for placing too much of an emphasis on the development of good habits for learning and living. He believed that it was the little things that counted. For example, his obsession with the toothbrush was legendary. His belief in the toothbrush as the foundation of civilization was often ridiculed by those who thought he was excessive with his emphasis on the minor details. However, when those beliefs are placed in a progressive context, one can interpret the importance of good habits to good personal hygiene and learning. Again, it's all connected. In American Pragmatism and Education, 1956, John Childs was also described an interactive process between the developing mind and the environment. Like Dewey, Childs believed that organic interaction is a continuous process whereby the responses of the individual to the environmental conditions take form and subsequently serve as the primary mode of experience. As Childs in 1956 stated, the behavior of the organism is modified as it begins to connect that which it undergoes with that which it does. Okay? Side note, like, you raise a black kid in a completely white community. What do you expect from the black kid? Right? You raise a black kid in a completely white environment, a white community, what do you expect from that black kid as it pertains to black society, black community, right? Think about it. Habit means, for Dewey, something more flexible and useful in behavior than the mere fixing or chaining by sheer repetition of a rigid reaction to a specific stimulus. As he conceives them, habits are arts. They signify growing appreciation of the qualities and the potentialities of the materials with which human creatures have to do, as well as increasing skill in the shaping of these materials for purposes of use and enjoyment. These explanations place habits at the core of experience. Experience in life is enhanced by these chains of habits that allow the individual a degree of ease as he interacts with the environment. If at the root of experience there are these chains of habits that evolve into the art of life, then to encourage mastery of these basic habits was a responsible thing for Washington to do. Not enough can be said about the type of student Washington encouraged. Tragically, these students had very little in the way of social skills or basic life skills. Remember I talked about those college kids, and you know them too. Some of you created them. Some of you interacted with them slightly in college, right? Or even in high school too, right? In building a civilization, it was prudent of him to teach the things of a civilized people. To teach character and racial pride was no small task, but yet one that required a deliberate plan of painstaking attention to small details. He took on the task of educating those who had the least and needed the most. Therefore, when examined in the realities of the times, Washington's emphasis on good habits of hygiene and study could be construed only as basic to effective living and learning. Booker T. Washington's emphasis on the importance of habits, unfortunately, has been used to caricature his image as obsessive and petty. Washington was very clear about his purpose. He intended to develop habits in his students as a means to a greater social and educational end. And that's a shame. It's a shame that, you know, we have a situation, and I wager that it happens in all society, in all races, and all whatever. But where we are a race that is we are in a predicament, and we need less of certain things, particularly negative things. We need less of those things. We need more positive. You know, I saw Onita say the other day in his Discord, and you guys should look into Onita Say, the Pro Black Perspective podcast on KWAZ Radio. You guys need to look into that and join his Discord. Right? He's organizing. Join his Discord. There's a lot of topics they cover in that Discord. In fact, sometimes it's kind of difficult to figure out who's talking where, at least for me, because I'm new to Discord. But go in there and join. You know, interact, socialize, learn. You know, ask how you can help. You know, and anyway, he recently had to deal with like a guy who I guess who's been trolling him for a little minute and name calling and all kind of, you know, this kind of low life type shit. And you know, we really don't need that stuff. You know, one of the things, whenever you try to do something in black society, there's always a contrarian. There's always someone to tell you, don't do that. Or, you know, they'll focus on one aspect of something, you know, oftentimes they make it personal about you and your parents or whatever it is. And they'll try to knock down the good works you do because of that one thing. And unfortunately, this was happening to Booker T. You know, he illustrated the importance of habits using the idea of a toothbrush. And people made made him, or tried to make him into like a joke, right? Because they tried to make him seem obsessive and petty, as Thornborough says it. And so what happens then is that the real message, the real works that the person is doing, you know, becomes overlooked. Again, back to only time I say, I saw something where, only time I say has been doing more live stuff, right? Has done more stuff, on camera or whatever. And, a guy was talking about this scarf he had on, or his head wrap or something. I'm like, dude, can you focus? What man talks about another man's attire like that? Right? Like, focus on what we're talking about. And that's something in Black society we gotta really stop doing that, because there's a flip side to it too. We look at the dude who's flossing or what have you, or looks good or flossing, whatever, and we think, oh, well, let's listen to him. And he's saying nothing. We gotta start to get our things in order. Right? In conclusion, the legacy of Booker T. Washington was a progressive experimentalist educator. The legacy of Booker T. Washington as a progressive experimentalist educator needs to be given the full recognition it deserves. It is tragic that he is so stereotyped as an accommodationist by intellectuals, black and white, to this day. By recognizing and articulating the realities of Negro life in Tuskegee, Alabama, Washington's educational vision for constructive learning through an integrated mix of industrial and academic subjects was perfectly appropriate and years later echoed in the cardinal principles of secondary education. It says, within the past few decades, changes have taken place in American life profoundly affecting the activities of the individual. As a citizen, he must go to a greater extent and in a more direct way cope with problems of community life, state and general governments, and international relationships. As a worker, he must adjust himself to a more complex economic order. As a relatively independent personality, he has more leisure. The problems arising from these three dominant phases of life are closely interrelated and call for a degree of intelligence and efficiency on the part of every citizen that can be secured through elementary education alone, or even through secondary education, unless the scope of the education is broadened. Washington's ideal of connecting education to the social life and needs of the learners for the purpose of enhancing the democratic prospect was powerfully unique and created a vision for future generations of educators, and I salute him. By synthesizing the concepts of social responsibility and educational growth, he would anticipate John Dewey's magnus opus, Democracy in Education, by over 30 years. Additionally, he would anticipate the form and function of the comprehensive high school during a time when less than 6% of all the high school age adolescents were attending high school. His vision for vocational education would be validated by Congress's support for publicly supported vocational schools with their passing of the Smith-Hughes Act of 1917. Beyond the vision that so clearly paved the way for progressive educational thought, Washington's tangible and lasting educational contributions are too numerous to list in this writing. Nevertheless, a short list of his contributions would include the following. The General Education Board, GEB. The idea for the GEB was launched at Tuskegee. As a contemporary to many of its founding members and as a beneficiary to John D. Rockefeller, Washington played an important role in the GEB's development. Created as a vehicle for the implementation of experimentalist and pragmatic educational ideas. The board lasted for 60 years and provided funding for experimental projects that would reflect the advanced theories by the best minds of progressive education. You know, that's something future folks can work on. Let's build curriculum, and future folks can work on such an organization, such a board. The Rosewall Fund, convinced by Washington to provide matching funds for communities that were willing and able to raise money for the construction of Negro schools, Julius Rosenwald provided dollar for dollar matching funds for the construction of schools throughout the South. By the 1940s, over 5,000 schools had been built from the Rosenwald Fund. It's Rosenwald, not Rosewall, sorry. Right? Sounds like a Jewish person. Offshoots of Tuskegee, many of the graduates of Tuskegee went on to create schools throughout the South. The larger of the schools were the Robert Hungerford Industrial School, Eatonville, Florida, the Snow Hill Normal and Industrial Institute in Snow Hill, Alabama, Utica Industrial Institute in Utica, Mississippi, and the Voorhees Normal and Industrial Institute of Denmark, Institute at Denmark, South Carolina, right? So that's another thing. As you would notice, when you graduate from a school or say a college, it's not uncommon for the college to reach out to you to lend your expertise in helping students, new students at the college, either in donations or you come in and lend some talents that you have or what have you. And particularly, let's talk about scientific research. In areas of scientific research, what happens is you have a principal investigator. And that principal investigator takes on students through the years, right? And those students, they learn more about this area of research. They conduct experiments, etc. And they later on compose a dissertation. Once that dissertation is approved, they would earn a PhD as well. So they become the students of, the disciples of the PI often. So oftentimes they go to wherever they're going to land at whatever institution. They'll go there and they'll do some aspect of the same or similar research as their PI. There's, of course, there's people who go a different direction, but for the most part, that's historically how it's been. You create these students and they go out and they take your school of thought, so to speak, right? Your lab objective, and they kind of do it as well. And it's a big thing. Like I've been in that world. It's a big thing where, it's a big deal for someone to say you're the student of so and such. As a matter of fact, in you getting a job out of those PhD programs, for example, a lot of times it's hopefully you did work with a PI who's like a named person, and just that PI's name alone will get you a good job. It's, so like this that they did here where the students left, that's a testament to the school as well. And that's what it is in that whole like scientific arena too. The testament of a PI, of a good PI, is the quality of its students. And so what Washington then did here shows the quality of their students, and the fact that the students realized the quality of the education they received. They too went out there and opened up or created schools throughout the South to do the work that Washington, presumably to do the work that Washington was trying to do. You see, there's an order to this thing, and I hope over time I can, really express it and get it across to you guys how it really works. But it's all interconnected, right? When those white folks go through those PhD programs, their PI looks out for them, especially if they were a good student, because his name is attached to your work, right? So people look at it as, well, if this student is so piss poor, then the PI must be ain't shit either. So it's a whole little dynamic there. But essentially, the students will go out and continue the work of the teacher, and that's what we see in number 3. Number 4, Anna Jeans gave over $1 million to the cause of training teachers to supervise Negro teachers in the rural areas. I don't like how that sounds. The stated purpose was to train teachers in the progressive educational method of connecting the schools to the activities of life. This gift was given in behalf of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington received funding to create a traveling agricultural school. The Jessup wagon, as it was called, was intended to teach farmers in the remote areas of Alabama the science of farming and other methods to increase their agricultural production. This method of demonstration farming was instrumental in building the South's economy. Look at that. This method of demonstration farming was instrumental in building the South's economy. The more you teach, the more access you allow for education, the better your economy will be for it. So sitting around being anti-intellectual and anti-learning ain't gonna help nothing. Waiting for someone to cut a check for you, that ain't gonna happen, and that ain't gonna help nothing. This is how you build yourself. You learn and you spread the knowledge. Right? Although the literature on demonstration farming gives credit to Seaman Knapp for creating the practice to fight the boll weevil, the written record shows Washington's ideas for demonstration farming, including the creation of the Jessup wagon, developing at the same time. You see, that's crazy. Despite his many accomplishments in the face of awesome problems, Booker T. Washington is not given due recognition in the body of literature on progressive education. This researcher was unable to find any mention of Booker T. Washington's work by John Dewey in the volumes of essays and writings produced by Dewey on the topic of progressive education. This is particularly troublesome since, for the most part, their lives paralleled each other in time and professional endeavors. The transformation of the school, progressivism in American education, Lawrence Kremen in 1961 never mentions Washington, despite acknowledging many of Washington's acquaintances, such as Walter Hines Page, the General Education Board, and the board's members Merle Curdy, and the board members. Merle Curdy acknowledges the progressive practices of Booker T, but does not place him in the same league as John Dewey, William Kilpatrick, or other noted progressive educators. At best, any mention of Booker T. Washington is typically a passing reference with no real significance to educational theory. To answer the question of why historians of education have failed to consider Booker T. Washington as one of the founders of experimentalist progressive education, one needs to consider the following. Booker T. Washington was not a university scholar in the manner of those who were writing and publishing their findings and ideas in progressive education. You see, this is the bullshit. Okay. Although he was a man of ideas, he was simply too busy building his school, raising money, tending to the broader issues of race, and being the wizard of the Tuskegee machine to concern himself with scholarly publications. He did not have the time, even though he wrote numerous books and articles on education, to pontificate on ideas that were targeted to scholarly. He did not have the time, even though he wrote numerous books and articles on education, to pontificate on ideas that were targeted to scholarly audiences. Second, the years that would mark Washington's professional life, 1881 to 1915, coincided with the period in the nation's history when racism against the American Negro was out of the way. You see, this is the stuff that really pisses me off. This should go first. Let's not pretend. This was 1881 to 19. This goes first. The social and economic hardships suffered by the Southern Negro after the Reconstruction period will adversely shape the social, psychological, and economic well-being of America for many years to come. As evidenced by the fact, even the members of the GEB were not willing to challenge the racial norms by allowing Washington to be an official GEB member, despite his involvement and his influence with the members of the board. His work was so intricately linked to the issues of race that his educational ideas were often obscured by those broader issues. Man, you waited all this time to just get to the point of that. The historic record is quite clear regarding Washington's contributions to American progressive education. The accolades expressed by professional educators toward his work and his accomplishments at Tuskegee are extensive. Specifically, these were not compliments offered for his being a successful Negro educator. After I read from a screen from a certain amount of time, it's real difficult for me to read. The compliments spoke directly to his effectiveness as an activist and bringing his progressive ideas into reality. Particularly poignant were the comments that spoke to Washington's ability to connect the lives of the learners to that which was being taught in the schools for the benefit of social and economic advancement. The educational critics found that Washington had successfully managed to create a curriculum that was an integration of what Dewey would later consider the experimentalist paradigm for curriculum and development. You see, one of the problems that's been digging at me in this reading, if Dewey came up with his shit 30 years later, why talk about him so much? Sure, mention him, but why talk about him so much? This paradigm would bring together the fundamental factors of the educative process, namely the nature of the learner and the design and function of the curriculum with the democratic prospect. I mean, I guess they talk about Dewey because he came about 30, his major writings were 30 years later, and he had the ability, in fact, his focus was on articulating his ideas. So maybe, it's easier for this author to kind of talk about Washington and his ideas, because Washington didn't take a lot of time, to write, scientific articles and whatnot. Maybe that's why, but I find it's a little too much at times, right? So this meant an integrated curriculum with hands-on learning at all levels. A curriculum not to be evaluated by traditional paper and pencil tests, but by educational outcomes for the more intelligent control of life conditions. He succeeded in large measure not only in promoting the implementation of a correlated curriculum for common learning or general education, but also in correlating the common learnings with education for occupation. Although the Tuskegee curriculum was deliberately conceived as providing for vocational education at a level of less than college grade, by 1902, only 20 years after the opening of Tuskegee, the follow-up of graduates revealed that more than half had entered the professions of teaching, school administration, nursing, and medicine, or were in graduate school. This contradicts the fallacy that vocational education does not mitigate social and economic mobility. If placed in a contemporary context, Washington's ideas could have profound implications for today's educational problems. Amen. There is a search in today's climate of educational reform to identify ways in which inner city children can learn and achieve academically. The focus has been on funding inequities with little emphasis on fundamental curriculum reform. Washington's method of teaching impoverished adolescents would be the ideal for students living in the inner cities with very little in the way of life experiences. The basic principle of connecting the curriculum to the needs and the nature of the learner could be the guiding philosophy. Following Washington's model, the life of the inner city could provide source materials for the curriculum. For example, the environmental ecology of city life in terms of water, air quality, and air pollution could be the basis to the science curriculum. The basis of science curriculum. The related political issues with the environment could serve as a social studies curriculum. The related political issues with the environment could serve as, the history lessons could derive directly from the history of the cities and their associated immigrant patterns. The architectural designs of the old houses could be integrated lessons on architecture, history, geometry, and urban decay. The industrialization of the cities could be lessons in economics and social studies. Following the immigration patterns of people moving in and out of the city could be an integrated social statistics course. You see, this is what I'm talking about. This is what you want to do. You're talking about building nations. Build knowledge. Build knowledge of nation building. Build knowledge of nation building. Seems I was disconnected there. Yeah, build knowledge of nation building. Right? That's what you want to do. You want to build knowledge? Build knowledge of nation building. Looks like my stream may have gotten cut off there, but I'm recording it, so it should be fine. So, so build knowledge. If you want to talk about building nations, build knowledge first, right? Build knowledge so that the builders can build. Like Tuskegee, communities could serve as the educational laboratories. Students could be involved in restoring abandoned houses and lots. They could learn the industries associated with those restorations and acquire saleable skills. The most important aspect of a curriculum based around the life of a city would be an awareness of its problems and a sense of responsibility in trying to find solutions to the problem. A unified curriculum modeled after the methods and ideals of Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute will help the rising generation of urban youth to develop the social power and insight through career goals that would enable them to become fully engaged in the human community. They would require community support and a willingness to depart from the traditional methods of education. This is a message to you guys. Giving due recognition to Booker T. Washington will not remedy the distortion and defamation of his work as chronicled in historical scholarship up to this time, but it will provide a better vision of possibility for the present and future of the rising generation of urban youth and the democratic prospects. And these are the references. And whenever you read research papers and you go through research papers, it's advisable that you really read, if not all if you can, but definitely some of the references, right? So in a future live stream, I might decide to read another one of these papers. And if you want me to read or do some follow-up readings to this Booker T curriculum, let me know. Leave a message and say, hey, I wanna hear more about this. I wanna hear more about the actual curriculum you're trying to build. But I'm telling you now, it's going to be built off a lot of what you learn in this paper that I read and in these references that they list, right? And so, again, reach out, ask how you can help. If you have one of the skills that we're looking for, you're a farmer, you're an engineer, you're a computer programmer, you're a plumber, carpenter, electrician, whatever it is, reach out and say, hey, I have some knowledge and I have some ideas about how to teach people by expertise from K straight through college age kids. I have an idea how to break it down. If maybe you don't have any of these expertise, but you have expertise in organizing information, curating information. Come on board, give a hand, we can do it. There's also the Cashapp. There's some things we're gonna have to do. We're gonna have to make these instructables, make the videos and stuff like that. Help us out here. Help us to not have to do it all on our dime. Again, this is for the whole community. This is not just for me. Not just for my kids. This is for all of us. Okay? Again, the Cashapp is okay, now this is not working now, but the Cashapp is $bittermedz, bittermedz. Reach out. Reach out and help. Anyway, this OBS thing has given me problems. This live stream seems to have stopped. This has been an episode of the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host Koku on KWAZ Radio. Support whenever you can, however you can, make sure to support. And until next time, peace.